Hi people, this is a little bit of a follow-up to my video on why I have turned away from the right. Um, just one disclaimer before I start, you may occasionally see a little bit of light coming down. Hopefully it won't be too much of a distraction. There's not much I could do about that. It's just the way the light bulb is. It's not really any way to control that. So hopefully it won't be too much of a distraction. Yeah, so very brief recap. The video I made on turning away from the right. It's not that I ever was right wing, but I call myself a centrist, and with that comes sympathies with both left and right. And very briefly, in recent years, I've been looking sympathetically to some right wing viewpoints, particularly around woke ideology, because I thought, well, I still think that there's a lot of ground for common sense. I mean, let's simplify this. If we look at the Tory leader, Kimmy Bednock, I think she's absolutely right to challenge some of the misogyny of the trans movement, for example. And when the actor David Tennant very obnoxiously said he just wished he'd go and vanish somewhere, it's an example of how, in that particular debate, I think women are silenced. Um, what Badnock has done is advocate for common sense. Now, I'm not particularly impressed with her as leader so far for all the reasons. I think just being far too, her whole approach to Trump is to try and attack Labour on that, rather than recognizing that, I mean, what David Lammy said, for instance, was old comments. I just think digging that stuff up was quite petty. Um, and actually, I don't think David Lammy's got anything to apologise for. But I digress. I digress. Um, so that was the basic thing that I had some sympathy with those sort of arguments. People like Douglas Murray and others who had challenged woke orthodoxy. I even briefly followed Lawrence Fox because there was that infamous appearance on Question Time when a member of the audience kind of had a go at him for being a white male, and Fox kind of pushed back against that and obviously forayed into politics. My issue with Lawrence Fox is I think he went a bit down a rabbit hole and he's come out with some nonsense since then. Uh, so I'm disappointed that people that I kind of respected, there's a few other examples, also figures who are not celebrities, people that I know in other capacities. I just feel somewhat disappointed that instead of just advocating for common sense, they go into an area that's in the conspiracy land, and it's just. I mean, put it this way: I think you can be a conviction conservative. I think you can be very critical of woke orthodoxy and all of that, and still see Donald Trump as a problem. Um, I don't agree with this idea that if you're a conservative, you have to support Donald Trump and Trumpism and all the stuff that goes with that. Another thing about that I dislike about the anti-woke right, which is that they go beyond simply criticizing woke ideology to conflating that with any sort of statement of compassion, right? So if we hear, let's say, for example, we hear about an anti-bullying campaign, they will immediately say, "Oh, it's just people being snowflakes or woke or something like that." Not at all. Um, I think it's a big mistake to conflate compassion with pandering to woke ideology, and that's what I want to focus on in this video. This is kind of the flip side of it because I say that I've moved away from that sort of anti-woke right because I think, I mean, for instance, GB News, I think that's all it's about. I don't see it much as of a news channel. I see it more as, and they've occasionally had punditry there that I do agree with, but it's become exactly what it said it wouldn't be, which is kind of a British Fox News, a sort of shouty, right-wing, populist pundit channel, and that's all it really is. They don't report the news; they just opinionate, and that's fine. I opinionate. Nothing wrong with having opinions, but they are what they said they wouldn't be, and that's glaringly obvious. Sure, they'll occasionally have a token left winger on, but it's unquestionably a channel that's extremely biased to the right. And you get other examples. Novara Media is very biased to the left, for example. So it works both ways. Um, but sticking with the left for now, just as I feel that conservatives don't have to jump on the Trump Musk bandwagon, I would say the same thing about left leaning people not jumping on the woke bandwagon. Now, this term woke, I've addressed this before, but I'll just reiterate. It's sort of become this, it's become a political football in the culture wars. I will say this, I think it's a bit rich for the left to accuse the right of waging culture wars because they are the ones, I'm talking about the woke left here, who aggressively push critical race theory, who aggressively push divisive terms like white privilege, mansplaining, um, and so on. And so I think it's a bit rich to then turn around and say, oh, but the right shouldn't criticize that. They're engaging in culture wars if they talk about these things, if they criticize how these words are used. No, you cannot aggressively push those sort of terms. Or another one is TERFs, TERF, which is used by the trans lobby to describe, as they see it, trans exclusionary radical feminists. Or another one I cannot stand is cisgender. It's a ridiculous word that has been coined only in recent years. Um, and it is a bit interesting that the trans lobby, they're very vocal against pigeonholing people and misgendering people and so on. Yeah, they've no problem labeling others as cis, even though most so-called cis people don't particularly like the term. Now, if someone calls me cis, am I offended by it? Not necessarily. I just think it's a meaningless term. I'm a straight bloke. That's it. I'm not. I'm not a cisgender. I'm a man. That's it. Um, so I think it's a nonsense term, and I don't think it should get much of a platform because I think it has been developed as a sort of way for trans people to um, push back as what they see as bigotry. I will say one thing briefly on that subject. My basic view on the trans issue is that I believe people have sovereignty over their own future. So I do think if an adult is deeply, deeply unhappy in their own body and they've suffered through gender dysphoria and so on, um, that's their right if they want to have a sex change. And in this country, it's legal when you're 18. Um, but where I draw a line is saying that other people have to agree with that way of thinking in the sense of um, someone who has been biologically male having a sex change to become a trans woman dictating to others, you must see me as a woman. I think that's just plain wrong. You cannot dictate people's conscience. You can't. Now, where I do have some sympathy with the trans community, and for the record, I have known a few trans people, where I do have sympathy is, I guess it can be very lonely. If you're looking at media, if you're looking at the debate on this, there is a lot of hostility and there is a lot of negativity. And I do think sometimes the mocking can be cruel. If someone has struggled with gender dysphoria, I don't think just mocking them is fair. But I have no time for trans bullies who want to hound women, like J.K. Rowling and others, um, simply because they insist that biology matters. Um, Starmer, when he was pushed on this issue, he said his starting point is about mutual respect. I don't think Starmer entirely helped his own case by by some of the statements on this prior to that. My starting point on it is that I respect the basic science of biology, and I do think there is a lot of I mean, I just think it is pseudoscience to say that a biological man can become a woman by definition, but they can become a trans woman legally and in terms of gender identity, fine. But you cannot force people to believe that someone who is born with male genitalia is a woman. That's just, I'm not going to put it this way, I'm not going to interact with a trans person and deliberately use a pronoun that would be hurtful to them. because it doesn't cost me anything to be polite. But I do draw a line at being told that I can think a certain way. You cannot dictate people's conscience on any issue, frankly. Um, that to me is crossing a line. So when you get, for example, hospitals talking about um, expectant people or using these sort of neutral terms because in case it might offend the trans community, I think that is nonsense. It's devaluing motherhood. It's devaluing femininity, um, or maybe not femininity, but biological womanhood. That's it is. It's devaluing that. So women feel angry about this issue, from what I can see, because they feel that the very idea of womanhood is being debased. And I think I agree with them. They have a right to be upset about that. Um, you cannot just say A equals B, and if you don't agree, you're a bigot. I think that's ridiculous. Um, but on this issue of woke ideology, like I say, the left have often accused the right of pushing the culture wars, yet they are the ones who aggressively push terms like critical race theory, white privilege, mansplaining, these sort of divisive terms that don't actually contribute anything to debate. I mean, just very briefly, if I go through those, critical race theory, to me, fosters a culture of victimhood. It promotes a message that if if you're white, you are basking in a life of privilege. You'll always have more rights than minority people, even if the facts don't add up to that. For example, in the UK, it is illegal by law to discriminate. So it factually isn't true. Now, in the United States, it's a little bit different because there is a contextual history there of Jim Crow and segregation and so on. But I do think in 2024, it goes too far. Um, and if you think of this narrative of telling, for example, minority children, you're victims. If you have any misfortune in life, if you don't get a job, if you have some other misfortune, then just blame white racism for that. That's a convenient go-to every single time. So it totally takes away individual decisions. It totally takes away individuality. Um, and naturally, if you're pigeonholing a big portion of the population as institutionally racist, that's just, I think it's a very flawed, very toxic narrative. Um, the same with white privilege that this taps into that. Mansplaining, when feminists come out with this, to me, that's a way of saying, this man disagrees with me. I don't like what he has to say, so I'm just going to frame it as if he's being patronizing because he has a different point of view. Now, you will get some men who are patronizing in the tone, but frankly, you get some women who behave that way as well. So why not just say, instead of saying mansplaining, why not just say he, as an individual, is being patronizing, but focusing on his sex tars all of us with the same brush. And I do think it's a lazy thing because I think some women will just use it whenever they are losing an argument or they can't handle the fact that a man disagrees with them or he's mansplaining. Maybe he's just having a different point of view. I mean, why don't we say womansplaining for women who get condescending and patronizing? So there's those double standards inherent in wokeism that I have a big problem with. I also think that this, when you see woke people, they'll always talk about being progressive and being compassionate. I call them out on that because I see the hypocrisy. How is it compassionate to hound someone from their job? How is it compassionate to assume guilt when you don't know the facts? Um, we saw with the Jussie Smollett, if I'm saying his name correctly, the actor who made up claims that he'd been mugged, and immediately you had left wing celebrities jumping on it and saying, "What a poor guy! He's a gay minority man. He's a victim." Turned out to be all embellished, although he had stuck to his story, but it just didn't add up. Um, this is not to say that claims shouldn't be taken seriously, but it's an example of how left wing celebrities will jump on these things. Now, I don't expect people to have known for sure that they couldn't have known that he was lying about it, but there's double standards. Why is the same benefit of doubt not given to, for example, right-leaning people or to white people accused of something, even though there was a case, and I highlighted this. I think it was called Oberlin College alone, just going off the top of my memory here. And basically, some white male students were accused of racially abusing some black female students. It turned out that the exact opposite was true. And it was actually the black female students who had aggravated the situation and instigated it. And these young men were vilified. There was angry protests at the college. And then when the truth was found out, what was the college's attitude? Oh, we shouldn't jump to conclusions. They suddenly found themselves being open minded when it comes to, or not even open minded, just blatant double standards. Um, so when I see woke people say things like white men this, white man that, it's as a white man, I resent it because I resent being tarred with the same brush as, for example, some militia type MAGA supporter. It just You cannot lump people together like that. And I will say this, I think that white straight men are the only demographic where there's basically a free pass to show open bigotry towards. And the thing is, the very fact that if you mention that, you'll get laughter from woke leftists just shows their hypocrisy. So their attitude will be, oh, how can you lot complain? You have all the privilege, you're the patriarchy, you're straight men, you have No, you cannot have a situation where you're saying bigotry is wrong, but one kind of bigotry is okay. It's wrong if it's directed towards a gay man, it's wrong if it's directed towards a woman, it's wrong if it's directed towards a black person, an Asian person, but white straight men are fair game. Cut the BS. Either you're consistent or you're not. And that is what I'm calling out about woke hypocrisy. Anyone who thinks that preaches about compassion and preaches about progressiveness and then thinks it's perfectly okay to just make generalized insults towards all white men, it's just ridiculous. It's also misguided because there's many white men who are of the political left and probably agree with them in other ways. I remember there was a guy who had been a keen supporter of Black Lives Matter, but he was put off by a racist rant given by their Toronto chapter, and he distanced himself from it. More often than not, you get movements that have some good principles, but then they ruin their own case, and I've seen this on left and right, on the left and the right. Um, so what I want to underline with this video is you can be a left-leaning person. You can believe in feminism, you can believe in gay rights, you can believe in the minimum wage, employee rights, a compassionate approach to immigration, all those things. But as soon as you start using toxic terms like white privilege, mansplaining, etc., etc., all that does is polarize people. Whatever way you want to justify it, that's all it does. It doesn't build bridges. It's certainly not progressive. Um, I mean, to me, the very epitome of racism is treating an entire group as one and the same. And frankly, to white men out there who lap this up, I'm a bit cynical of them because I'm thinking, well, wait a second, you're a white straight bloke. Why are you okay with being, lumped together with some white supremacists type? It's and they'll say, oh, but that's not what they're doing. That's not what they're doing. It's a little bit, the point I would make is have some self dignity. Recognize that you could be part of a progressive movement, but if individuals in that movement start making polarizing, inflammatory speeches and using terms that just push people away, then it's going to just piss people off. It's not going to build bridges. Um, And people do see the double standards, and it isn't just white men who see this. There are, plenty of women who see this and minorities who see this, who recognize the double standards. But, even talking here, I know there's people out there who would say, oh, what's he got to complain about? He's a white guy. My message there is you know nothing about my private life. You know nothing about my concerns, my anxieties. I saw a piece on the Onion News, and, usually they're quite funny. They had this thing about a white conservative man who's scared of everything, and The point about Onion is it's satirical, it's meant to be funny, but that wasn't one of the best ones. It was just a bit lazy. It just didn't really, they're usually based on absurdity and surrealism and absurd situations. That just seemed like let's just throw all these stereotypes and throw it into one little thing. So anyway, my issue isn't with the political left because there's a lot of areas I agree with them on, but I do differentiate between the sensible left, the genuinely compassionate left, versus extremely obnoxious, extremely self-righteous woke people who it's almost like they've got a little radar when you're talking to them and they're almost looking for reasons to be offended. Like you could just tell by the tone of conversation, by the way they sort of question everything you've said. And I've been in this situation. It's rather tiresome because how do you communicate with someone like that? Um, there was another term I forgot, microaggressions. That's another one I've no time for. If someone's being rude to you, or if they're not listening to you, just tell them. Say, look, I've already said that. For instance, one would be if you're a minority person and someone asks where you're from, it's all to do with tone. If they say that in a sort of way that's rude, like, "Oh, where are you really from?" Yeah, I could understand people being defensive about that. But if someone is simply making conversation, then don't be so fragile. Don't be so sensitive. I mean, put it this way. I've grown up in Northeast England. I still have my Northern Irish accent. My whole adult life, I've heard people talk about Ireland as if I'm Irish. Now, I'm not Irish, I'm British. And that's how I see myself. But I'm not going to I'm not going to run to the police and report a non-crime hate incident because someone's made a mistake. That's ridiculous. Um, so I don't like the term microaggressions. I think what I call it is micro control. It's about trying to, um, it's not about trying to get people to be more open minded. It's about just being hypersensitive to every single word someone says. I mean, if they make a mistake, just correct them. That's all it takes. Don't feel like you're a victim because they've made an honest mistake. I'm not talking about people being rude deliberately. I'm talking about people getting pilloried as racists and bigots because they've made a genuine mistake. It's ridiculous. So I do think there's a place for compassion, and one reason I'm critical of the right is I do think they've a bit of a compassion deficit. But well, some of them, I should say. Um, but the left also has this very tiresome self-righteousness that also gets, it's also polarizing. I see the BS on both sides, quite honestly, and I call it out. And if that makes me unpopular, so be it. It's a risk I'll take because I'm being true to myself. I see the BS on both sides. So, um, if you're a left leaning person, you may not agree with everything I say, but as long as you're reasonable about it, as long as you're open minded, I have no problem with you. We may have disagreements, but if you, for example, if I have a debate with someone and their first way of thinking is you're a white straight man, I'm thinking, well, wait a second, you don't even know what my opinions are. We haven't had for a discussion, and you're already jumping on my demographic. That isn't open minded. And that's what's so insufferable about woke leftists. They, for all the talk about, oh, don't pigeonhole people, they have no problem pigeonholing a certain demographic, white, straight men. And even saying that, you just can hear their laughter and their sarcasm, like, oh, what have they got to complain about? But I insist that if it's wrong to display bigotry against any other group, why should it be okay for one group? That doesn't make any sense. It's it's a nonsense argument. It's a weak argument. It's an infantile argument, and it's an argument that exposes their hypocrisy because you don't know what an individual's life experience has been. What if you're talking to a guy, a white guy, and he might have some right wing views, but how do you know he hasn't been a rough sleeper? How do you know he hasn't had both parents killed in a car crash? You just don't know someone's background unless they make it clear. So, but this is a lesson for all of us, myself included. We shouldn't jump to conclusions about someone's background. You could even have a rich person who perhaps, money can get a lot of things, but doesn't necessarily take away some misfortunes in life. For example, someone could be born into inheritance, but they could still have some genetic medical condition, or some debilitative disease. So being born into an inheritance doesn't necessarily mitigate something like that. Would you say that someone who's a millionaire, um, who's then a victim of a serious crime, they don't deserve sympathy? So it's, we shouldn't jump to conclusions about someone's background unless they themselves are promoting it.